This is the My Dark Path podcast. As most American school children can tell you, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The voyage of Christopher Columbus aboard the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, which resulted in the first European colony in the Americas, is a part of the story we tell ourselves about where we came from. But what most of those same school children won't be able to tell you is that 1. Columbus never actually set foot on the American continent. He only ever landed on the island that he would name Hispaniola. And 2. Christopher Columbus died believing, wrongly, that he had sailed to India. He knew nothing about what came to be called the New World. In history, the details we include or overlook mean everything when it comes to what they tell us about the past. And in a day where most media sources want to manipulate emotions instead of inform, the best way to understand is to read and study competing sources of information. For example, the idea that Columbus was trying to reach India by sailing to the west because he believed that the world was round instead of flat is a gross mischaracterization about the understanding that ancient people had about the nature of the earth. But the reason Christopher Columbus remains such a topic of fierce debate is because he did so much more than land on that island. After all, he wasn't just an explorer, he was also a businessman seeking profits. And while he made those profits for himself and others, there are costs that still reverberate through the world today. Hispaniola is the second largest island in the Caribbean, next to Cuba, and it's divided into 2 independent nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And to this day, it is a sunny, lush, and mesmerizing place. And despite sharing the same island, today these 2 countries are on very different trajectories. By a single simple measure, per capita GDP, the Dominican Republic is about 10 times wealthier than Haiti. While I can't comment on Haiti personally, in my time in the Dominican Republic, I've observed the country is focused on education and creating a business and political environment that's attractive to investment. But as idyllic as the landscape is, there's an ongoing sense of unease and struggle and pain, and in large part it's because of the history that led to this single island containing 2 separate countries. And since Columbus arrived from Europe, this island has seen more than its share of disaster and horror. And there's one event which even the citizens of this island rarely discuss, but which seems to encapsulate so much of the tragedy they have had to endure. And ironically, it involves something else which came to this island from Europe, a little plant so ordinary and so unremarkable that people all over the world use it as a decorative garnish with their meals: parsley. Parsley, it's claimed, played a role in the brutal mass slaughter of tens of thousands of people on Hispaniola, right as the eyes of the world were focused elsewhere during the Second World War. It's come to be called the Parsley Massacre. But was this little plant even involved, or is it simply a way to help illustrate the story? If we're going to understand this, we're going to have to go back to the way this island looked before 1492, before any Europeans arrived. History owes it that much, at least. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and welcome to Season 2 of the My Dark Path podcast. In every episode, we explore the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal. So if you geek out over these subjects, you're among friends here at My Dark Path. We hope you'll check us out on Instagram, sign up for our newsletter at mydarkpath.com, or just send an email to us at explore@mydarkpath.com. And now in 2022, we're launching our Patreon, where subscribers will have access to exclusive full episodes, starting with our special mini-series, a My Dark Path tour of the history, science, and paranormal in Cold War Moscow. Finally, thanks for listening and choosing to walk the dark paths of the world with me. Let's get started with episode 28, The Parsley Massacre. Part 1. The earliest names we have for the island translate to the Island of Mountains or mother of all lands. The indigenous people living there are now known as the Taino, but they weren't a monolithic culture. In fact, we have evidence of 5 distinct kingdoms of Taino living on the mother of all lands, not to mention at least 2 other significant tribes, the Arawak, who originated in what is now known as Venezuela, and the Carib. The Carib, by the way, are whom we derive the name Caribbean from. Their word for the land of mountains was Haiti, the source for the eventual name of the country of Haiti. All these indigenous people enjoyed the diverse biosphere abundant with natural resources and a stunning array of flora and fauna. The Taino did hunt and fish, but their lifestyle was largely agricultural. They learned how to live and thrive using the soil and minerals available to them. There were conflicts among the various kingdoms, but the largest source of discord was the Carib. The Taínos saw them as aggressive and warlike, and we do see evidence that the Carib were conquering and subjugating territory in these islands. And it may be this fear which motivated them to trust these new European visitors with their superior technology. The Taíno believed that the Spanish would help protect them against the Carib. Christopher Columbus first set foot on the island on December 6, 1492. He first referred to the island as a la Isla Española, and later he shortened it to Hispaniola, meaning the Spanish island. From this very first proclamation, it appears that Columbus had little interest in mutually beneficial relations. He was on a mission to extract the wealth that he could find from this island. In his first trades with the natives, he learned that they had gold, and he was feverishly convinced that there was much more where that had come from. On Christmas Eve, less than 3 weeks after his arrival, one of his ships, the Santa Maria, sank in the bay. Only 2 ships meant reduced cargo capacity for the return trip to Spain, so Columbus made the decision to leave behind men and supplies. This is how the first European settlement here began. It was a simple decision of accounting. Since the encampment was established on Christmas, it was called La Navidad. It didn't last long, only until Columbus returned in 1493. This time they built a temporary town which they named La Isabela in honor of the Spanish queen. Then came the first permanent settlement, Santo Domingo. It was established in 1498 and to this day serves as the capital city of the Dominican Republic. It was the beginning of Europe's presence in North America. It was also the beginning of a systematic genocide of everyone who had lived there before. And while we don't have knowledge of the total population of the land of mountains before Columbus's arrival, we do know that in the 20 years that followed, genetic studies suggest that at least hundreds of thousands, but possibly millions, died as their land was seized, homes were destroyed and cleared away, and survivors were taken into slavery to work in the gold mines. The settlers realized that conditions on the island were favorable for growing sugarcane. The plant wasn't native to Hispaniola, but settlers from the Canary Islands brought it over, and the first sugar mill was established in 1516. Sugar was immensely profitable, and as the island started to produce it, demand for it back in Europe grew exponentially. Money and political power flowed toward the plantation owners. If you could control sugar, you were as powerful as a king. Vast areas of land were cleared away for sugar planting, killing off much of the native flora which had evolved on the island. The process of harvesting and milling sugar was also immensely dangerous. Hands and limbs could be crushed in the mills, and you could be scalded by boiling water. Some slaves died from falling into the boiling sugar itself. The European settlers were running out of Taino, Arawak, and Carib, and so they started to import slaves from Africa. It's what we now call the transatlantic slave trade. Slaves would be taken to the Americas aboard ships where they would harvest sugarcane. Molasses and rum derived from the sugarcane would be sent to Europe, which would pay for tools, manufactured goods, and textiles, the fruits of European technology, and then those would be shipped to Africa with which to buy more slaves. Christopher Columbus was, of course, long dead by this point. He had only visited Hispaniola 3 times in his lifetime. But his arrival makes me think about the phrase life cycle, which we use to describe the journey of a single organism from birth to death, or the pattern of a living environment. The island, its flora and fauna, its indigenous people, they had a life cycle which was by no means peaceful. but by no means abundantly prosperous, but relatively stable. And in many ways, it's as if Columbus's arrival, the intrusion of a foreign people, technology, and even plants, set off a death cycle, one which still consumes the island over 500 years later. And remember this when we start talking about Parsley. With Hispaniola generating so much wealth for the powerful and connected in Spain, other colonizing nations wanted in on the action. France and Great Britain moved aggressively to establish their own colonies throughout the Caribbean. This set off decades of naval battles, of islands seized, fortified, and lost, and the heyday of piracy, as some ships in the Caribbean stole and conquered for themselves. France, buying the services of some of those pirates, gained a foothold on Hispaniola that the Spanish were unable to beat back. And finally, they signed a treaty recognizing France's claim to the western third of the island, while formalizing their claim to the ownership over the other two-thirds. And here is where the story of one island becomes the story of two nations. Haiti, ruled by the French, is just under 11,000 square miles, roughly the size of the state of Maryland, while the Dominican Republic, serving Spain, stood about 19,000 square miles, a bit larger than Vermont and New Hampshire combined. There were ongoing disputes, skirmishes, incursions, and of course, ferocious competition over who could make the most money from this island. But the two nations remained separate, divided by mountain ranges which make it difficult to find passage across the middle of the island. Two nations with two stories, and let's take a look at each of them. Part 2. Now, the unchallenged rulers of Haiti, the French set about cutting down nearly every forest in the territory, using the trees for timber and filling the cleared land with plantations for sugar and coffee. Like the Spanish, they systematically murdered the indigenous Taino while importing slaves from Africa to work the plantations. On average, an African slave would be worked to death after 7 years. It's in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean where a supernatural myth began, which turned into one of the most popular fictional monsters in our own culture. Many African slaves were so desperate to end their life of torment that they committed suicide, hoping that at least their spirit would go home to Africa to be with their ancestors. The slave masters told them instead that if they killed themselves, they were committing the sin of theft, robbing their masters of the labor that they were entitled to. And as punishment for this theft, their spirit would be trapped forever as their lifeless body continued to move around. They would become zombies. In 1791, Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, led a violent rebellion against the white French plantation owners and successfully took control of Haiti. France itself had not only been deeply involved in the American Revolution, but it had just experienced their own revolt in 1789. They were not prepared to give up without a fight, but after so many years of fighting, deploying armies across the ocean eventually became too costly. Napoleon set a force of 30,000 men, but most of them died from disease. The liberated slaves wrote a constitution, and on the 1st of January 1804, Haiti declared itself independent from France. This makes it the second oldest independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, and it was the first nation ever created from a successful slave rebellion. The wounds of slavery, though, did not go away quickly. France demanded, as a condition of recognizing Haiti's independence, that Haiti reimburse the French for its lost property. And by lost property, they didn't mean the land, they meant the slaves. The French king, Charles X, backed up his demand with a fleet of warships. Haiti, a brand new nation just starting to govern itself, was forced to pay 150 million francs, not to the slaves, but to the slave owners. By point of comparison, that's 10 times more than what the United States paid France for the Louisiana Purchase. It took over 120 years for Haiti to pay off this debt, and in order to finance it, they had to borrow from French banks at a heavy interest rate. Now, there's a lot of gray area in this definition of independence. Saddled with this crippling debt, and with none of the infrastructure or mechanisms of a civil society, Haiti fell prey to the aggression of autocrats and dictators for over a century. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson intervened, sending our military to Haiti to restore order. They occupied the country for the next 2 decades. And after this, Haiti's military ruled unchecked until an election in 1957, which gave the presidency to a medical doctor by the name of François Duvalier. He became known as Papa Doc, and after an attempted coup against him by the military, he instituted a massive purge against anyone he considered disloyal. He formed a secret police force, loyal only to him. They were called the Tontons Macoutes, which means Uncle Gunny Sack. Uncle Gunny Sack is a boogeyman from Haitian folklore, a sinister figure who comes in the night to steal bad children away by stuffing them in the bag he carries with them, and then takes them back to his lair to devour them. Not only did the name inspire fear, it was in fact accurate, as the Tonton Macoutes would frequently kidnap citizens in the night, stealing them away to be tortured, murdered, and simply never heard from again. The details of their atrocities sound like something out of a horror film, and in the 1960s and 70s, the leader of the Uncle Gunny Sacks was a man named Luckner Cambrone. His nickname was the Vampire of the Caribbean, and he earned this nickname. To make money, he would extort or outright take blood plasma from prisoners and local civilians, selling it to American medical labs. And when this wasn't enough, he stole corpses from hospitals and prisons to sell to a medical school. At this point, we need to spend a moment discussing Voodoo. Now, that's not a mispronunciation. One of the most widespread religions practiced by Haitians is a distinctive blend of multiple ancient African beliefs coupled with the Roman Catholicism practiced by the French colonists who once enslaved them. There are many remarkable forms of faith practiced by African communities who were stolen away from their homelands and evolved into new forms and traditions of worship along the way. Religions such as Santeria, Obeah, and Rastafari, as well as the Hoodoo and Voodoo, which made their way to Louisiana. The Haitian form is called Voodoo, and it's been widely misunderstood over the years, often associated with sacrifice rituals and dark magic. Papa Doc Duvalier did more than a little to perpetuate this misunderstanding. Citizens of Haiti were encouraged to believe that he had powers of dark sorcery at his command. Remember when we discussed the dictatorships of the Kim family in North Korea? Part of maintaining dominance in a cult of personality is to elevate the ruler to literal superhuman status. And with the power to dispatch ghoulish individuals like Luckner Cambrone and to make people disappear in the middle of the night, it was a story people were willing to believe. The bosses of the Tonton Macoutes, it was said, were all active practitioners of the darkest and most fearsome form of Voodoo. But despite all of his supposed powers, Papa Doc did have to run for re-election, which he did in 1961. The government proclaimed that he won 1,320,748 votes to 0. Then, in 1964, there was another election to determine whether he should be named president for life. With the Tonton Macoutes supervising the election, the outcome was hardly a surprise. Duvalier then amended the Constitution so that, on his death, the presidency would pass to his son, Jean-Claude. Baby Doc, as he was called, took power in 1971. His rule saw Haiti become increasingly unstable, with resistance growing to his power. In 1986, Baby Doc fled the country, stealing $900 million in aid money as he went. A new constitution was written, but elections were canceled due to threats of terrorism. More elections happened in 1988, but the military nullified the results. It wasn't until 1990 that Haiti finally had internationally recognized free and fair elections for the presidency and parliament. The newly elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, won in a landslide, but after just a year, he fled the country as well, in the face of another military coup. After an international outcry, Aristide returned and was reinstated, but with conditions in Haiti still violently unstable. In 1994, President Bill Clinton did what President Wilson had done 80 years before. He sent the American military to maintain order. In the year 2000, Aristide was declared the winner of another election, but this one was widely seen as rigged and illegitimate. With civil unrest leading to yet another round of tragic bloodshed, Aristide was once again driven from power, and ever since, the government of Haiti has changed hands countless times, whether through disputed elections or, in July of 2021, the assassination of their president, Jovenel Moïse. The investigation into Moïse's murder is still, at the time I'm recording this, implicating senior government officials, but the full story has yet to emerge. Compounding these human-wrought catastrophes, Haiti has suffered disastrously from Mother Nature. In 2010, a 7.0 earthquake devastated the island, leaving as many as 300,000 dead and over 1.6 million homeless. Worse still, after the earthquake, a United Nations peacekeeping station contaminated the nation's primary river with waste that had been infected with cholera. A nationwide outbreak caused as many as 10,000 more deaths, and the UN so far has offered nothing but an apology. With so much accumulating suffering, Haitians in recent years have fled their country in massive numbers, and this has created a crisis elsewhere as they have traveled over how to care for these refugees. And it's especially impacted the nation they share an island with, the Dominican Republic. Remember that Haiti was created under French control, so that even after its independence, its culture, its language, and its history are all irrevocably colored by its time with the French. Their language, Haitian Creole, is considered a dialect of French. By contrast, the Dominican Republic was dominated by the Spanish. So, as the years passed, these two countries weren't just divided by a line on a map, but by cultural differences that diverged wider and wider. Spain maintained its colonial power over the Dominican Republic for a century longer than the French held Haiti, but they too were eventually driven out. The Dominican people declared their independence in November of 1821, over 3 centuries after the first arrival of Christopher Columbus, but their freedom was short-lived. Just months later, Haiti annexed the whole island of Hispaniola, declaring it to be one nation. Years of resistance by the Dominicans spilled over into outright war in 1843, and when the fighting stopped, the island was once again 2 separate nations. Hostility always seemed too close for comfort, though. For one thing, the 2 nations never fully agreed on where the border between them actually lay. Not only did the Dominican Republic fight off multiple invasions by Haiti, they had their own internal civil war. They even briefly fell back under Spanish control again, and when President Wilson sent American soldiers to occupy Haiti, he sent them to the Dominican Republic as well, occupying the island for 8 years. In this atmosphere of unending fear and outside threats, this country too fell under the sway of a dictator promising protection from the outside world. After a coup in 1930, there was a so-called election in which the winner with 99% of the vote was Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. His nickname was El Jefe, the chief, and he ruled the Dominican Republic for over 30 years until his assassination. Trujillo's life paints a fascinating but disturbing picture of how the violent elements in a society can gradually infect and overtake the channels of political power. He was born into a lower middle-class family, but from the start showed a knack for organizing people through aggressive means. While serving time in prison, he organized and led a criminal gang called the 42. But when the American military arrived to occupy the island, he seemingly turned over a new leaf, joining the local military. He impressed the U.S. Marines, who gave him training and equipment, praised his leadership skills, and encouraged the Dominican military to promote him. And this they did, and he ascended from cadet to a general in a jaw-dropping 9 years. And when he turned his eye towards political power, all that American training in modern warfare, the loyal followers he'd attracted within the military ranks, they served him all too well. Not long after his election, the island was struck by Hurricane San Zion, an intense Category 4 storm which killed as many as 8,000 Dominicans. El Jefe seized the opportunity to do 2 things: declare martial law and rebuild the battered capital city and fill it with monuments to himself. Just a few years later, he renamed the capital Trujillo City. The gang he formed when he was just a teenager, the 42, well, they still existed and were a vital tool in protecting his power. They worked outside of the country's justice system to kidnap, torture, and murder any resistance within the population. The plan was simple: keep El Jefe and his puppets in power forever. But by the 1950s, the unrest was becoming more and more difficult to contain. An entire generation had come of age under him. They had no memory of the colonial occupiers, of the fear of outsiders that their parents held. All they saw was the dictator who was oppressing them today. Trujillo unleashed his Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, the military intelligence service. They worked much like the Tonton did in Haiti, acting as a secret police force to repress the population further. But Trujillo made a fatal mistake. He had a fierce rivalry with Romulo Betancourt, the president of the powerful South American country of Venezuela. He backed a rebel force trying to oust President Betancourt, and in return, Venezuela's president gave his support to the Dominican opposition. And many other nations in the region backed his efforts. On May 30th, 1961, El Jefe Rafael Trujillo was assassinated by his own army officers. When you cultivate a system with no mercy and no hesitation to use violence, and no loyalty but to its own preservation, the results are as natural as the seasons. 50 years after the murder, the BBC interviewed General Antonio Imbert, one of the conspirators to the assassination. He told his interviewer, quote, "The only way to get rid of him was to kill him," end quote. So that's what they did. Part 3. Parsley is a remarkable herb. Its origins are in the Mediterranean, but it has been successfully transplanted and grown all over the world. With the savory touch it adds to dishes, it's ubiquitous in Spanish, French, and Italian cuisine, but that only scratches the surface of its presence in our food. Even the name itself is a bit of a travelogue, an English naturalization of a German word which itself was derived from a Latin word, which began as a Greek word meaning rock celery. And being used in both French and Spanish cuisine, it can be found not only in dishes all across the island of Hispaniola, but in many of their home gardens. In some of the stories we tell on this podcast, this area of commonality might point the way to some silver lining, a lesson about food overcoming the barriers of history and culture. But in the sad history of this island with two nations, parsley turned out to play a shocking and tragic role. Remember what I said earlier about how the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic has been in dispute for about as long as the two countries have existed. In the northern border region is a river called the Dajaban, but it has another name, one that's spoken differently whether you're in French-influenced Haiti or Spanish-influenced Dominican Republic. To the Haitians, it's commonly called Rivière du Massacre. To the Dominicans, Rio Massacre. In English, you can probably guess its name is the Massacre River, and sadly, there's more than one story of mass killing associated with it. It first earned its name in 1728 when it was the site for the killing of 30 French buccaneers by Spanish settlers. With Spanish colonial interests spread thin across Central and South America, Hispaniola was suffering from pirate raids. Unable or just unwilling to protect the island's coast, in 1606, Spain's Philip III had ordered all of its subjects to move inland, closer to the capital city of Santo Domingo. The theory was that this would keep the citizens of Hispaniola safe. Instead, it left the coastal regions wide open for pirates to establish their own bases. This long-standing conflict is what led to the 1728 massacre. After the pirates were murdered, the settlers dumped their bodies in the river. And the name took on even greater meaning in 1937, the time of the Parsley Massacre. Despite the long hostilities between the two nations and the lack of freedom and stability in their governments, there were still some ostensible efforts to resolve their differences diplomatically. At least twice, Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo met with Haiti's president Stenino Vincent, with the goal of settling the border dispute. Many years of Haitian incursions had created a sort of blended regions where citizens of each nation dug in and attempted to plant their firm roots for their own country. In 1936, Trujillo signed a treaty officially defining and recognizing a border in Hispaniola, but privately, he had other plans. To him, this wasn't just about the ownership of territory, and not even about the centuries of Haitian invasions. His belief was that his nation had lost land, which was rightfully theirs. To him, this was a fight over who were the superior people. Trujillo celebrated his nation's long association with Spain, and he believed that the Dominican people were genetically greater because of their European ancestry. He saw the Haitians as, quote, pure African stock, having driven off their French superiors. He believed that Haitian refugees, inferior in every way, were responsible for all the problems plaguing his own nation. For decades, Dominican sugar plantations relied heavily on Haitian laborers freely crossing over the border regions for work. But with the Great Depression pummeling economies all over the world, Trujillo had no answer for the collapse of his own sugar-driven nation. And rather than show the responsibilities of leadership, he would blame his own failures on immigrants and stir up violent racial hatred against the culture and people living on the other side of his border. In late September of 1937, the Dominican Army began to round up Haitians along the border, and then on October 2nd, El Jefe delivered a speech in the disputed border region very near the Dajabon River. There he announced that he needed to answer the pleas of hard-working Dominicans living near the border who were victims of theft by Haitian criminals. He would solve their problems, he said, by removing all the Haitians from the territory he now considered to be rightfully Dominican. We don't have any confirmation whether or not any of the local landowners ever made such a request, and we don't have records of any sort of a crime wave. In fact, this is very analogous to the current situation in the border between Russia and the Ukraine. But this didn't matter to Rafael Trujillo. It was just a fig leaf, a public pretext to cast himself as a protector rather than a genocidal aggressor. By the time he made his speech, over 200 Haitians living in this area had already been killed, and now Trujillo ordered his army to murder every Haitian they could find in the northwest region of the country. No one was to be spared. Troops armed with guns, bayonets, and machetes flooded the territory and methodically worked their way through every acre of land, killing every man, woman, and child they believed to be Haitian. And this is where the humble, ordinary herb that garnishes our dinner plates, parsley, enters the story. See, in Spanish, parsley is called perejil, and to pronounce the word properly, you're supposed to slightly trill that letter R, but in French, the plant is known as persil, with no trill. Without trilling that R as a matter of practice in everyday speech, it would almost be impossible for an ordinary person to convincingly fake it, especially when someone is pointing a gun at you. According to the story, Trujillo's soldiers carried sprigs of parsley. They would stop anyone they encountered, hold up the plant, and demand that the people identify it. If you pronounced it in the Spanish way, the soldiers considered you Dominican, and you were spared. But pronounce it in the French way, and you were determined to be Haitian, and you were executed. If you recall and go back all the way to episode 3, the story of this haunted Taipei Hyatt, you might remember the story we told you of the White Flower Massacre. Neither country kept reliable enough records of the population in the border region, but the best estimate is that after just 1 week after Trujillo's speech, between 12 and 35,000 people were massacred. Those who survived tell horrific stories, victims being hacked to death by machetes, having their limbs bound before being thrown into water to drown, or of being strangled to death in front of family members. Soldiers laughed and drank, making up games like throwing babies in the air and trying to catch them on their bayonets. Even those who were able to escape their captors risked drowning in the violent currents of the Massacre River. Their bodies and the bodies of countless victims were carried by the river out to the sea, never to be counted or identified. Not every incident in this week of horror was an evil one. Some Dominicans who lived in the vicinity risked their lives to help their Haitian neighbors escape, secretly sheltering them in their own homes, helping them safely across the river by night. There are always heroes to be found, and their small personal acts of risk and sacrifice so often seem to get swallowed up by the greater atrocities happening around them. Now, Washington, D.C. was well aware of what was happening. Diplomatic cables described the border situation as, quote, a systematic campaign of extermination, end quote. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was only beginning to assemble the facilities, machinery, and fanatical followers who would bring about the Holocaust. On Hispaniola, Rafael Trujillo's attempt at a Holocaust was already underway. Up to this point, the official American position was to see Trujillo as an ally. As with many dictators in Central and South America who kept business running smoothly for American companies, he was viewed as a force of stability in his country. But this open effort at mass murder could not be hidden under political euphemisms. President Roosevelt's administration demanded that Trujillo's government pay reparations to the victim's family. Trujillo assured FDR that he would comply, but unsurprisingly, he never paid. And from there, the nightmare disappears into history to a surprising extent. Trujillo made sure that no media outlet in his country even reported the story. And to this day, many Dominicans don't even know that it happened. Part 4. When he returned to Spain in 1493 after his first voyage, Christopher Columbus wrote a widely circulated letter describing his experiences. He referred to the place he visited as India, somewhere beyond the Cathays. He goes into great detail about the islands and their people, offering vastly exaggerated and heroic accounts of his own deeds. History has poked many holes in his self-celebrating narrative, especially the boasts of the vast wealth he believed that could be had on the island of Hispaniola. If we see him as a businessman trying to inspire investors in a growing enterprise, the hyperbole makes a degree of sense. But when you consider his outright dismissal of the dignity and humanity of the Taíno and the other indigenous citizens of the island, you see a dark path laying beyond his promises. Behind it all, though, you can see a genuine admiration for the beauty and splendor of the island. Quote, Hispaniola is a marvel, he writes. The mountains and hills and plains and fields, the soil, so beautiful and rich, end quote. In 2012, candlelight vigils were marking the 75th anniversary of the Parsley Massacre. Standing on either side of the border, participants described their candles as a border of lights. Not everyone agreed with the choice to spotlight the incident. For many, it's ancient and evil history, and the reviving of the memory of it risks increasing the never-ending tensions between the two nations. Given the natural disasters Haiti has suffered in recent years, undocumented refugees are a huge presence in the Dominican Republic and the source of constant controversy that needs no reminders from the past. But others believe that it's the silence about the massacre, the lack of recognition by history, which makes it more likely that atrocities like it could happen again. And now there's even an open argument as to whether or not Parsley played a role in the killings, with only secondhand testimony. Some now suggest that this may even be an urban legend exacerbated by the lack of any official record. And yet, as we found in many of the stories told on this podcast, the detail probably sticks because it seems to sum up so well the compounding tragedies and crimes that have been visited on this island ever since Columbus arrived. A plant that was foreign to the soil, two languages which were never spoken by any of the indigenous people, but rather by two rival colonial powers exploiting the island for wealth. Two nations created by lines on a map with no regard to the on-the-ground reality of people living near those lines. Many fortunes have been made from the soil of Hispaniola, whether it was from sugar harvested by slaves or the banks holding debt markers over nations struggling to live independently. Following the devastating Haitian earthquake of 2010, a movement arose demanding that France return the reparations it aggressively forced Haiti to pay to French slave owners all those years ago. The money would amount to at least $28 billion now, more than 3 years' worth of Haiti's national gross domestic product. Money like that might make a life-changing difference in allowing a nation to rebuild its infrastructure and institutions, and perhaps save thousands from starvation. The French government has, thus far, shown no interest in the proposal. Are the wrongs committed in the 20th and 21st century an inevitable result of Columbus's arrival in the 15th? Do colonization, exploitation, enslavement, and genocide flow inevitably into one another like the waters of the Massacre River? It doesn't feel like they should, and yet stories like this have happened throughout human history. There's a dark path that winds through the history of the island of Hispaniola. But also consider that if each person, family, culture, or country is wholly dependent on its past, the excuses for future failure to thrive are already written. Yet, somehow, this beautiful island with its warm weather and abundant soil has never fully escaped this cycle of death. Thank you for listening to My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host. I produce this show with Courtney and Eli Butler, and our creative director is Don Purdy. This story was prepared for us by Kevin Wetmore. Our senior story editor is Nicholas Thurkettle, and our fact checker is Nicholas Abraham. Big thank yous to each of them and the entire My Dark Path team. Please take a moment and give My Dark Path a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. This really helps the show, and we love to hear your feedback. Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of history, science, and the paranormal with me. Until next time, good night.